Okay, so here we are. The session's moving people. What parts of lockdown do we want to lock in to deliver our 2050 net zero ambition? We've got a great panel of speakers here today. Professor Jillian Anable. Jillian is, let me see, I'll put that there. Jillian is, excuse me, from the Institute of Transport Studies at University of Leeds, and her research expertise is in the future of the car, bringing together technology and societal developments, including electrification and new mobility services to explore the concept of car usership. Along with Jillian, we have James McKemey, Head of Insights at Podpoint, who is a passionate advocate of electric vehicles and the third longest serving member of staff at Podpoint, one of the UK's leading charge point operators who, and so I think James is going to bring an insight that is about the journey that electrification has had over the last decade, as well as insight into the charge point operator and infrastructure provider roles. We hope that Jonathan Bray, Director of Urban Transport Group, is going to be able to join us. Jonathan has been the Director of Urban Transport Group since 2008. His career has focused on developing and advocating transport policies, working with the UK's network of city and regional transport authorities. We're also pleased to be joined by David Skipp, Director, Partnership and Innovation at Ford Mobility Ford Motor Company. David's role is to build a portfolio of opportunities to grow mobility business solutions. He also works closely with a number of industry bodies and is currently chair of the Intelligent Connected Automobility Working Group of the UK Automotive Council. And finally, and by no means least, Rob Whitehead, Director for Strategic Projects at the Centre for London. Rob leads on transport and on climate emergency and environment. His current work includes micro-mobility and decarbonising heat in London. Rob is going to kick us off with a presentation on the impact of COVID has had on travel patterns and on the environmental as a backdrop to our debate. So at this point, Rob, I'd like to pass over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm going to try and do the old screen sharing trick, so bear with me. Hello, everyone. All those of you who are participating. Let me have a go. You should now be seeing a big yellow screen. Yep, all good. Right, so I'm just going to do a whistle-stop sort of tour around the kind of nexus of net zero, COVID and transport, with a little bit of a reflection on what we know, what we don't know, what we might want to keep. So now, in theory, this will move when here we go. Yes, so just a quick reminder of UK decarbonisation. So the sort of good news is that we've now got a legal commitment, as everyone will know, for net zero by 2050. The bad news is lots of flat lines. So these are the kind of mega sectors in the UK that have not really been making much progress towards decarbonisation. The great exception is energy production. So increasingly, day by day, electricity is becoming our friend in the struggle for decarbonisation. Very important. A quick sort of whiz round some of the options about how we decarbonise moving people around. So we can travel less. We can shift to modes which are lower or zero carbon. We can switch to private or shared electric cars, bearing in mind the point about electricity, and we can improve our public transport fleet. Those are essentially the main options. I'll be coming back to those to an extent. 2050 is really hard. 2030 is much harder by many degrees of difficulty. And this is the target that the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is pretty much adhered to. He's likely to restate this in the now delayed mayoral election. That gives us less than 10 years. And we know already that our plans are insufficient. So this is a little snapshot of the bus decarbonisation plan for London. If all goes well, according to plan, we get to net zero buses by 2037. That's not good enough anymore. So just a quick look at what's happened in lockdown. I won't dwell on some of the very well-known aspects now, but needless to say, it's been a health crisis. The economy's been in deep freeze. Here you see bottom left some of the sort of patterns of in retail across a few equivalent world cities to London. The regional breakdown in recruitment levels on the right-hand side bottom, you can see that recruitment is under 50% of normal across every region of the UK. The economy is in a standstill. And we know that transport has been hit hard too, deliberately so, in many respects. So just to unpack that a little bit, this is UK data now. I've just chosen a few of the kind of bigger aspects, and we'll hear more about this as we go along. So this is what transport in the UK has looked like broadly over lockdown. So in essence, everything went into deep freeze. Freight's a slightly different picture, I'll come on to that in a sec, in March. And it's been ticking back up since then. Now, cars, the trajectory is quite steep, and we're back to about 80%. Buses, we're at about 30%. Trains and tube, though, are still below 20%. We've taken a look at this DFT data, and just to try and sort of illustrate some of the aspects of this. And here I've thrown in freight, commercial vehicles, just for a comparison. So I'm just contrasting here with these lines what the normal state is, what the minimum was over the crisis, what the maximum we've achieved has been, and what it looks like now. So what you can see there is essentially everything contracted very, very severely, including freight, which went down to below 30% at its absolute minimum. But that's now recovered, if you look at the green and orange lines, to pretty much 100%, and that persists. Car use, as I said, is back to about 80%, having been down to almost 20%. And the other modes have been shrunk heavily and are sort of struggling to come back. The tube and the train worst. I deliberately omitted cycling from that one because cycling has been a completely different story. Here it is with cycling added in. At its minimum, it dropped by about half. This is on trips. At its max, though, it rose to almost 400% of normal. I think it was an end of April weekend after the long spell of sun, where suddenly everyone was out on bikes. Now, it's really important to note that this isn't a revolution in commuting. This is leisure travel. This is leisure use of bicycles mainly. So just bear that in mind as we go forwards. It's gone down now as the weather's got a bit more normal to about 140%, and also other things have unlocked. More on cycling in a second. Just to say as well that the distribution of this bounce back is going to be uneven. We know this. It's not going to be spread, a bit like the sort of sectoral variations in the economy. It's going to be uneven across transport as well. So although we see trains ticking back up to a degree, this is a picture from this Tuesday morning of the rush hour train from East Sussex to London. This is the peak train into London Bridge. There's no one on it. Not exactly a great decarbonisation success story. Some of the other effects of the lockdown is our air has got cleaner. We know in some of the densest, usually most polluted areas that it's dropped by around 50%. That's great for our health. The same is broadly true across CO2 emissions. So this is in purple, contrasting 2020 with the previous, I think it's 5-6 years. And you can see that that line tracks, but is about 50% lower. So just a bit more in depth on some of the kind of active travel stuff, because we did some surveying of Londoners with Savanta Comrades. And what we found is that, yes, people have been walking and running more during lockdown. When you net off those that say they've been doing more against those that say they're doing less, you get to about plus 18 saying they're walking or running more. Interestingly, that number grows quite a lot when you ask them, do they expect their walking and running to go up after lockdown compared with before lockdown? About a third say they'll be doing more walking and running compared to their previous, like, pre-COVID life. Now that is brilliant if it's true. That may be inflected somewhat with sort of exercise optimism. We'll see. Now, when you ask the same questions about cycling, the numbers are a bit lower, but very interesting in terms of travel patterns and sort of mileage. Cycling has gone up in London, net during lockdown, but only 6% when you net off those that are cycling less against those that are cycling more. When asked whether they would cycle more after lockdown compared with before, 3% of Londoners say they will. Now that might seem small, but when you cast that against the only 2 or 3% mode share that cycling has in London overall, you know, busy central London might look like there's loads of bikes, but as a mode share across the whole city, it's not very substantial. So 3% of Londoners doing more cycling could be quite significant. It could lead to, I guess, at its most optimistic, a doubling of cycling. If people supported these temporary bike lanes that I'm sure most people are familiar with now, and 2/3 did. We also asked them about teleworking, home working, whatever you want to call it. There's lots of sort of prognostications and conjecture that this is going to be a real revolution. I think the things have changed. It's definitely softened attitudes and improved attitudes. I think it's fair to say. But when you ask Londoners, do they think they'll be working more from home after lockdown compared with before, you see a pattern of about a 5% uptick in expectations. Now, I think it's fair to say that this is before really they might have any idea of what employers are going to be doing. Now, some of these people will be losing their jobs, sadly. Some of them also will be working for employers who are already planning to shrink their, particularly in central London, I think, office footprint. So we don't really know what this will look like. But is it a 50% growth in home working? I think it's very unlikely that it's going to be in that order of magnitude. The big kind of policy change that we've seen through lockdown has been this prioritising of active travel. Initially to accommodate extra pavement width for social distancing, but then also to accommodate more cycling. This has been a very big deal and has seen us witness on our streets new temporary schemes like the one you see on the left, and also the acceleration of new permanent schemes. That one on the top right, I think in Manchester, is a particularly good, fine example. Very much linked to this, we're seeing an acceleration of trends from pre-COVID. I would say there is a generalised rise in what I like to call micromobility. I think quite a lot of other people do too. So that's grouping bikes, e-scooters, e-bikes, cargo bikes together. These are small, light, quite slow forms of getting around, particularly suited to urban travel, but I'm sure we'll discuss a bit later, maybe suited to longer journeys as well. But these are interesting because they're, I think, part of the decarbonisation solution. They're pretty accessible. They're relatively affordable. They're also being delivered via kind of service layers, so shared schemes and other approaches, innovations in insurance and theft policy, for example. And we're seeing growth afoot in all of these areas. So e-scooters are going to be, they're legal now in some form in the UK for the first time as of a couple of weeks ago. Cargo bikes are growing, it looks like about 50% per annum. E-bikes are now more than 50% of the market for bikes as a whole in Belgium, leading the way. Halford's reporting bike sales up 50% during lockdown. So just a few thoughts on what we know and what we don't know. So we know that there's a reluctance to use public and shared transport, and that is a policy issue of the highest order. We know the economy is going to take a long time to recover. We know working from home will increase and persist to some extent. Air travel is going to be lower for a while. We don't know what the recovery level will be. City centres are going to be quieter for a while. London retail, central London retail is down 80% still this week. That is a quite catastrophic change for many in central London. And we also know, just going back to my point at the very beginning, that addressing the climate emergency needs radical policies now. Stating the obvious, I think, but worth putting up there. Things we don't know. We don't know how long it's all going to take. We don't know what the health measures, how the COVID pandemic is going to play out in the next phases. We really importantly don't know the stickiness of these new habits. probably the longer the lockdown, it's fair to say that the new habits will stick more. We don't know if there's going to be a surge in car ownership, but it's looking possible. We don't know how much appetite there's going to be for a radical change in decarbonisation terms during these sort of twin crises, economic and health. So just to wrap up, these are my sort of quick take on things we definitely don't want, what we definitely do want, and what's not clear. So I would say definitely don't want to carry on discouraging public transport use. That might be a bit controversial. We don't want to grow car use. We don't want a complete shutdown of aviation. Where I'm not clear is really whether we should be looking for fewer trips or shorter trips, or both. I'm not clear, and I think it's a huge debate on where we should stand on aviation. Other than to say, and this goes to my definitely column, we need to do a bit less of it, definitely. We definitely want to keep cleaner air and lower carbon emissions, wherever possible. We want to keep being more physically active. We definitely want to keep pushing on micromobility. And I would just finish with one of the great, for a kind of policy wonk, one of the really interesting aspects of the pandemic has been the propensity to experiment with policy. And that's been really refreshing. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you very much, Rob. And that provides a great backdrop for our discussion now. Before we kick off and I open it up to our panel, we've got a poll. And I'd just like members, delegates to sort of log on and vote on that poll, just to get a feel as to how people feel that the climate impact of moving people will be affected by COVID, and whether it's, you know, this is a serious threat, will have no impact, or whether it will have or is an opportunity. So we could just see what the results are, and as the results come in, we're then going to take an opportunity to go around the table to talk to our panelists to get a feel from their perspective. And overwhelmingly, in terms of our delegates, there's a clear view that this is an opportunity to accelerate decarbonisation of mobility. So if I could then open this around as an opening question to each of you in turn, so from your perspective, what has been the impact of COVID in your area? And what are the key challenges in terms of putting it back onto a trajectory that will allow us to recover and have a green recovery in moving people, in mobility? And perhaps, can I come first of all to Jonathan Bray from the Urban Transport Group? Jonathan.
How long do you want me to bang on for?
We've
Sure,
yeah, so I mean we want to go through a number of questions, so if we keep it moving, that would be great. We've only got 55 minutes for this session.
All right. Okay, well, what I prepared for was a question that was posed around what would I keep from the lockdown in order to meet the longer range targets. So I think what I would keep is the willingness and the ability to move very radically and at pace to do things which wouldn't have seemed possible before, and also finding that you can do things differently and accepting the reality of the situations we find ourselves in, rather than hoping if we prevaricate long enough, then those situations will enable us to carry on, will adapt themselves to us to carry on as we used to be. So I won't keep much from what we got through, but I would keep that. I think 4 thoughts for the future or provocations for you. I think, first of all, not very provocative for this audience, but I think electrification of transport, urban transport, should be one of the central projects we have as part of a wider green recovery, which obviously fuses with the decarbonisation agenda. I think people will get that. I hesitate to use the examples of the Soviet Union in the 1920s, but electrification used to be a heroic project, and I think it could be again, and something that people would understand that this is a national priority, but it can create good jobs, and that it can go with the flow of where the capabilities of where technology is taking us. But we also need to, as part of that, make much better connections between what we do on transport, what we do on energy, and also more widely than that, what we're doing around the built environment, because transport knows where it's going. The built environment has a heck of a long way to go in terms of decarbonisation, but there are connections between the two and also between resilience. So making the connections across professions and cross sectors is going to be important to that. I'll give you one example that I would like to quote to bring it to life, which is the project on the underground where waste heat from the underground in Islington is going to be used, or is being used, to provide heat for local housing estates. And that's the kind of synergies we need more of. The second one was about the bus. I think the bus is in big trouble. It was in big trouble before we even started with this crisis. And now we've got rid of all the passengers, and how many are going to come back? I think we need to reimagine what the bus can be, instead of seeing it, at least outside London, as this commercial entity, which it no longer is, 95% funded by the national or the local state. It should be a green utility for cities as they develop. We need to reimagine it, and we need a funding model to match that. So all this money that's being pumped into electrification is not going to create a lot of Potemkin villages where we have a few very nice routes with green electric buses, but not much else. We need to be looking at more of a continental model, a utility model, but green as well. The third thing I would say is when we talk about transport in our minds, we usually got pictures of city centres in our heads. But city centres are, of course, important. But that's the easy bit as far as anything is in decarbonisation of transport and modal shift. We need more policy around the suburbs. There's a stack of reports a mile high about what we should do about transport in cities. There's a stack a millimetre high around what we should do about the suburbs. But that's where the real deep challenges are, but also some interesting solutions around e-bikes, around obviously electrification of transport, also, and Jillian will know all about this on the call, about increasing car occupancy rates, car share and all the rest of it. So I think we need to shift some of our attention to what we do about the hard bits, and that will also help with social cohesion, I think, and get away from this city versus suburb, retro versus metro approach we can have. The final thing I would say, and it's come up before, is let's stop doing things that actually make things worse. Why on earth are we continuing with this zombie road building program that is just there because it's there? It's lost all grounding in what it might actually achieve. There's a kind of closed little world of the road building community, which is carrying on quietly. It doesn't really take part in debates like this, doesn't need to, because the money is still coming its way. But let's spend money on where it can do good rather than doing harm, and not even working in its own terms. It's very poor in terms of job creation. It takes an enormous amount of time to implement. It just redistributes economic activity into yet more sprawl, of which the UK has no shortage of. So let's stop the zombie road building program and use it for something useful instead. My final thing I would say is let's keep thinking big, because we've been forced into thinking big during the crisis. Let's keep that rolling in a positive way during the recovery. And because if we don't do that, the COVID-19 is going to shape us rather than us shape that legacy. So let's keep thinking big.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for having at least two final points there. It might have been three. David, Skipp, I'd like to come to you now, and obviously Ford, steeped in the automotive industry, but I know that you're in a part of Ford that's thinking quite radical. From your perspective, how do we come out of this in a positive way, and what are you seeing, particularly in terms of thinking about the future of transport and the future of transport, where I think we've been thinking about increased shared mobility and flexibility and autonomy. So from your perspective, what can we build upon, and what do we need to reset to get on the right trajectory?
Wow, what a big question. So if I answer this from the industry perspective rather than just a Ford perspective, and all the thinking that we're doing in the Auto Council to advise government on policy, in one sense, the COVID crisis has been a horrible experience and very painful for many people, but it's allowed almost an experimentation in some sense of all the things we've been talking about on mobility and e-commerce, all in a very condensed period of time. So if we look for some positives out of this, I think we've all been looking at why do we need to move. I'm actually slightly disappointed with some of the stats Rob showed around the future of my working at home possibilities. But if we can work at home and we can make use of e-commerce, then I think there's a huge impact to carbon going forward that we've only talked about and had no data on. So the things like that, I think we can take as real positives. I think one of the things that's really interesting is, in that decision making of why we want to travel, the need for human-to-human contact has been really, really important. Whether that's family contacts, face-to-face, work contacts, with those are the things that we're really missing, I think. So we've got to make provision for some of that, but maybe do it in this more balanced way that we've experienced over the last weeks and months. Now, we think about some of the challenges that we've been talking about in terms of carbon around the electrification agenda. All of that remains. It's the key decision around, are people willing to pay for the more expensive at the moment electrified products to reduce CO2 when they do need to travel? And all of those challenges remain, and investments continue, scale up continues. We will get there. Regulation has a part to play, and we've got to make this really intelligent mix of transition from ICE into plug-ins into full BEV. But the real answer is to move into some form of shared transport. And again, I think that how we emerge from COVID and how we find a way to deal with shared transport in a good way is absolutely essential. So consolidation of people, consolidation of goods, that's what takes congestion off the road, which is one other positive outcome of the last couple of months. But it's also a key contributor to lower carbon.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for those thoughts. I'd like now to turn to Jillian and Anable. I know you've been thinking about consumer habits and habit formation and how you change that. We've really got consumer habits. Personal. What we do is taking a real kick. As a result of COVID, we've all been doing things that perhaps 6 months ago we wouldn't have thought we'd be doing. Not least having a conference online here, which is the first for LowCVP. What can we positively take out of this? I think one of the things that reflected from Rob is that that we've seen a move away from public transport. We've seen people going back into the private car, which isn't a direction of travel that we that is one of the things that we don't want to keep.
Well, Jonathan, you and other people who know me on this webinar will know that I'm not really known for my positive thinking. I'll give it a little go. What I will say is that I agree with David, and I agree with some of the other points, that the ability for us to have experimented and have had to have done things so quickly and proven some of the things that we can do quickly when necessary is the real positive from this. But there's, I'm soon into the buts and I'm soon into the negatives, because I do think we have to get some of this into perspective. So if we take the working from home situation, I mean, for all of us sort of zombies on this call, we're looking at the world through this kind of computer lens. But in actual fact, the maximum number of jobs that are conducive to working at home is around 30% of jobs. We had a statistic quoted in the plenary panel this morning, an AA survey, where apparently 56% of people said that they could work from home. Well, the AA are known to mainly, if not exclusively, poll from motorists. So if you actually take a representative poll of the population, it is by far the minority, albeit significant minority, that can work from home. So that's the one thing. And also commuting was only ever 18% of all the distance travelled in the first place. So you've got a whole other 80% of travel. What are we going to do with that? Cycling, similar kind of perspective needs to be given, in that it's great news, anything that can increase the amount of active travel, no disputing about that. But we're doing this from a very low base. 1% of distance undertaken by cycling, 2% of trips. In the Netherlands, It's 8% of distance undertaken by cycling and 29% of trips. Does that mean that their carbon footprint from travelling, and not even including air, is better than ours? No, it doesn't, because they own as many cars and they drive them on very long distances. And 3% of the trips that we do account for a third of all the miles we do, and they're mainly on leisure. Has anyone really mentioned leisure travelling this morning, other than the pootling around on bikes that gets done on leisure? So it's about getting some sense of perspective of what really needs to happen. And so in that case, this is actually a line, I think, from one of Jonathan Bray's blogs that he's written on this topic, which is that it's very plausible to think that both cycling and car use is will increase. Both of those things are going to increase potentially. Now, it depends what happens with the recession. It depends on the trajectory of the virus. None of us know these things. We have a survey at the moment, a very large-scale survey across 9 different locations, London being one of them, in the UK. So 9 different city regions. We've got a sample in the first wave of just under 10,000 people across those locations. Unfortunately, I'm not able to bring you many of the results, but what I can say is that what has happened and what people are saying that they will be able to do or want to carry on doing, etc., is very different according to which location you're looking at. And that's going to be because the economic circumstances, the connectivity, what's gone on with the public transport networks, whether or not that certain key services are still going to be in existence and still going to be in existence, and the sort of economic welfare of people in those locations. And that's what really matters for travel. Not so much, I mean, the public transport network and the fact that buses are looking at a very difficult short-term future is very important. But ultimately, what really matters is what we're going to do with our infrastructure and how we are going to achieve any sense of locking in a sense of localism and reducing the distances that we travel in total, and focusing much more on some of the journey purposes that we tend to sort of ignore.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. So yeah, there we've got some behavioural issues in terms of are we moving to private cars? Are we moving to cycling? What are we doing about leisure journeys and the need for our journeys? I'd like to turn now to James McKemey, who's been deep in the electrification project, and ask from your perspective. And I think, what's needed now? What's the impact? Where are the opportunities? But also, amongst our panel, we've got a couple of people from London, a couple of people from Leeds. What about smaller towns and rural areas as well?
I think there were 4 questions there. I'm going to have to try and remember them in order. I think some of the points we've covered here are very, very valid. Obviously, we started with the Centre for London, so of course that's a very urban-centric thing. Podpoint, we predominantly charge private cars. We also charge light commercial vehicles, so they've been slow to the market. Clearly, those are very poor solutions, transport solutions for urban centres. That's pretty clear. I mean, if you go into London now, very few private cars making journeys in central London. It is cycling, it is public transport, and we need to do more of that. Now, of course, let's move on to impacts of COVID upon our sector. So, like everyone else, I think we've seen a turn down in how sort of busy we've been as a business, leads coming in, although that was brief. And certainly in our industry, we've been in a period really of hypergrowth, and we will be in that period really for much of the next decade. So I think we hit our June sales target for home charge sales on the 9th of June or something. So it was, then this is in the middle of the pandemic, so it gives you an idea of kind of the sort of pent up demand that's there. I think one of the big unknowns for us is the workplace sector. And one of the really key things for anyone to get their head around if they're looking at particularly electric cars, and by all means, cars are no panacea, that they don't solve everything on their own, but they are an incredibly good, flexible transport solution for the individual, and that's why they are so popular. And electrifying them starts to remove quite a substantial part of their harm. The challenge with charging electric vehicles is putting the charging infrastructure in the place where your vehicle spends its time doing nothing. The places our vehicles spend most of their time doing nothing are home. Secondly, work. And we sort of, when we model this, we think about 90% of all charging will happen between those two locations. Okay, so in the previous discussions, we had a lot of talk about the public network, and that clearly has a very important role to play. Really, we think that's only 10%. Of charging. The key thing is home and workplace. And when we talk about workplace, that's a mix of those who workplaces are nice to have. They're living the dream. They charge at home, they drive to work, they charge there, they drive home. But it will be the backbone of charging for many people who cannot charge at home because they park on the street, they don't have a regular parking space, etc. And the third of those is kind of depot charging. So yeah, last mile deliveries, but even up to HGVs as well. If they can charge, on DC chargers or 22 kilowatt chargers overnight, depot charging is going to be very, very substantial. In the context of COVID, of course, we're not absolutely certain where we're going to be in terms of using workplaces in the future. I think I've seen some interesting comments down the side. There was a comment about osmosis of knowledge within the business not being in the office. I totally agree with that. I miss my office on that basis. But I would imagine that will largely return and will move back in that direction. But obviously, from a sales perspective at the moment, you wouldn't be surprised to learn that sector's had a big impact so far on our workplace leads. What needs to happen to drive this back? If I'm honest, it's still a pretty buoyant area. I mean, the best-selling car in the country is the Tesla Model 3. So I don't want to be too miserable about this. It's already going pretty well. A bit of more of the same, a bit of regulatory certainty, etc. Maybe we'll have a chance to answer some specific policies in time. But certainly we're seeing increased interest in electric vehicles. It's an opportunity to keep a lot of the environmental improvements we've seen through the coronavirus lockdown, without losing some of that freedom, which is very important, as we say, for, I live in rural Sussex. My ecosystem, my life is spread over the probably a 20-mile radius from here. It wouldn't be possible to really do that without a vehicle, and I'm certainly by no means alone here. I have an electric vehicle, therefore my impacts are very much small.
Thank you very much, James, for bringing that perspective from electrification and the wider perspective from outside of urban areas. I want to switch over to another poll now, which starts to refer to which specific measures, and I think we've got a perspective here of, we're working in partnership here. There's things that government can do, but it can't do everything. What can we do? What can we do as companies, organisations, local authorities, private consumers, individuals? And I'm just on the poll now. We've got a number of measures, and I'd just like people to sort of vote on that and see what they think it would be the most effective measure in terms of us getting back online with a green recovery in mobility. Right, and we've got a clear view here that investing in infrastructure for green transport has got virtually half the votes. So what I'd like to now is go around our panelists and ask them, what single measure would you like to see being introduced to help aid the recovery, to deliver put us back on the trajectory for net zero in moving people? So Rob, perhaps I can come back to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I'm going to say the kind of fantasy one and then a bit more of a realistic one. So the fantasy one, but I don't think it really is as fantasy as perhaps I suggest, is that we just ban burning fossil fuels by 2030. Simple. Take the moonshot. Everything else will follow. You need one policy. The more realistic thing is that we need to rehabilitate public transport urgently.
Thank you very much. I am, and I'm not now. So, David, I'm going to come to you next. What single measure would you like to see being introduced?
I point to demand side. That's been our struggle. We need the demand to uptick so that we can benefit from the scaling and the investments, which are huge, that have already been put in, can be paid back, and we can afford to invest more. Some of that is covered by the points James was making around electrification point availability, but it also comes down to maybe a combination of carrot and sticks around the suburban areas where electrified products can make a significant impact in lots of short trips, encouraging purchasing of electrified or partly electrified vehicles, and encouraging alternatives, and maybe some sticks to encourage those alternatives.
Thank you. Jillian, be positive.
Well, okay, I mean, I know it's a classic academic thing to do, which is to want to pick apart the question, but I suppose I can take it as a given that everyone knows that there is no one measure, etc., etc. But I do feel I need to preface what I'm about to say with any of the great measures that we can all put forward come to naught if we have some things like a road building program and an regional airport expansion program, etc. So let me just put that on the table first. So with that caveat, even though I'm not an economist, just as I would have answered this before COVID, it's the same answer now, which is we have to get the prices right in the transport system. The real cost of motoring has been going down. The cost of electric vehicles are going down, and we know their running costs are very cheap. In fact, the road building program itself is predicated on the fact that EVs, or part of it is anyway, that electric vehicles will induce demand for motoring, and therefore we're going to need new roads. So these perversities are the single most thing, and if we're going to regenerate public transport, we need to get the prices right. They've not been right, they've never been right. Here we are now recognising that it's an essential service. We've been subsidising it for years, but not properly. We're now subsidising it fully in this current post-COVID crisis. Let's take that as the reset.
Jillian, I want to come to James next, and then Jonathan. So James, what would you like to see as a single measure?
This is a very easy question to answer apart from the word single and not having a so there's a bunch of stuff I'd like to happen, and yeah, I really like to unfreeze fuel duty. That'd be immensely helpful, and I think that was Jillian's point. I'd also like to move that to a road taxing situation, which a chap from Jacobs has made a case for in this session, and that'd be very helpful in terms of the mood implication. I guess the key things for us are, we interface with government quite a lot, so we like to think we're not missing anything obvious in what we talk about. I'm going to be nice to the government here and say that they've got a few things which are looking pretty handy. Project Rapid is one of their projects looking at developing the en route network of high power chargers. And when we talk high power chargers, we're talking in excess of 150 kilowatt up to 350 kilowatt. Sort of motorway service stations or areas close to the strategic road network. Getting that in place is going to be transformative to a lot of people in terms of getting into electric vehicles. Never again will you say, well, I haven't got range. I couldn't get an electric car, I won't be able to get there. Well, yeah, you can. It will be very, very easy to do. You'll be absolutely stunned how little you use it once you come out of an internal combustion engine car into one of these. As Jillian was saying, it's those long journeys, which are 3% of people's journeys, that actually you hit these en route chargers. Most people will leave work and there's 250 miles, 300 miles in their car. They'll wake up every morning, there's 300 miles in their car. And from that, you won't really need the en route network. But we buy cars to do 100% of our journeys. We don't buy them with the idea, well, I'll do almost all of it. And that provision will be very, very powerful. So if we could get on, deliver that, that'd be magic.
Thank you very much for those. So fiscal measures and a range of other things there. Jonathan, I'm going to come to you last, and what would you like to see? And I think one of the questions that's been raised is public transport. Can we make it economic again, and with social distancing? But so I don't know if you'd like to touch on that. But yeah, what would...
Well, I think we need to empower city regions to crack on with the job of tackling what is a very complex problem, because there's no point in just looking at the transport elements in isolation. You do need to be doing this alongside what you do about the built environment, about resilience, and about energy. And there are certain things that should be done at a national level, technical standards, fiscal policy, but it's not going to work if we continue in this country to infantilize small city regions in terms of them constantly having to bid for relatively small amounts of money on different timescales for different things. How are you going to crack a long-term problem like decarbonisation on that basis? These city regions are the size of small European countries. So getting the right mix between what the government needs to do on a long-term basis and then empowering city regions to implement this stuff in ways that work in their locality is my one thing, which I would add to the list of all the other one things that are also equally valid and important. I think you're on mute.
Yes, there we go. I've done it again. So thank you very much. I'm just gonna okay, so we've heard there that we've heard about demand side measures to get consumers acting again to help build demand. We've heard about pricing of the environment, and I guess polluter pays, and recognizing that we can have these big projects like road building, airports, which can undo a lot of the benefits. We've heard about fiscal measures to encourage better behaviour, and we've heard about empowering cities and regions to be able to get on with it and think about big projects. We had a last poll here, which I was going to ask people to complete, but and just in time, it's come forward. So I'd like you to just to fill out the last poll, which sort of basically based on what you've heard today in the discussion. How do you feel? What statement? How do you feel about how optimistic we are about being able to tackle some of these issues and put ourselves back on the right trajectory? And you know, what is possible? Do we have to have a trade-off between growth and the environment? So if people could complete that poll. And despite Jillian's cynicism, we've got a very positive group of people here. I'm very pleased to say that 55% of people, of our delegates, think that we can get a win-win for the environment and economic recovery, which is fantastic. I hope that is the case. I would just like to, we're now, the main plenary session is going to go live now. So I'd just like to thank all our speakers on the panel today, and everybody's been listening in for attending today. And I think we just now need to close and move over into the live session.